my people. Before Europe learned to measure oceans and before distant courts dreamt of empire, an African polity rose where stone met wind and water. It stood on a highland balcony, looking down at the Red Sea and saying, quietly and with authority, "This coastline will answer to us." This is Aksum, an empire that traded with Rome and India, minted its authority in gold, and carved permanence into the face of the earth. Remember the name. Remember the scale. Today we follow its ledger, coins, stelae, ports, and prayers. We trace how a kingdom on the roof of Africa commanded horizons. The first thing to understand about Aksum is place. It was not an accident. Perched in the northern Ethiopian and Eritrean highlands, Aksum controlled terraces and watersheds, gullied valleys and hidden springs. The hills were not obstacles. They were architecture. They forced cultivation into discipline and gave the rulers a living bank, granaries, storage pits, systems of redistribution. From those heights, a road unrolled toward Adulis, the port that became Aksum's open window to the world. To run an empire, you need two things, food and routes. Aksum engineered both. Terraces held soil like promises. Roadways connected valley towns to the capital. People moved with purpose, agents, mule drivers, scribes. The language those scribes used, Ge'ez, was not merely utilitarian. It was a technology of governance. A script makes a state legible to itself. It inscribes authority into law, prayer, and memory. Ge'ez did that work. It wrote treaties, minted legends, and outlived the political forms that birthed it. Think too of how the highland climate shaped bodies and minds. Cooler air meant fewer disease burdens and more stable labor. The landscape produced a society capable of long projects, stonework, irrigation, the slow logistics of empire. Aksum's reach was not improvised. It was deliberate, grown by design out of a geography understood as policy. Power in Aksum loved permanence. If others built monuments to be admired, Aksum built monuments to be read. Across the plains and ridges rose obelisks and stelae, colossal shafts carved from single blocks of granite, scaled to proclaim rather than merely mark. Their facades mock the ephemeral. Their false windows and doors state, plainly, that the houses of the elite do not expire with flesh. They ride time. These stelae were statements in stone, about lineage, about claim, about the right to lordship. The largest rose like an attitude, enormous, vertical, visible from a dozen miles. The labor that cut and hauled these stones demonstrates state capacity, coordination, logistics, the ability to marshal manpower and sustain it. To understand Aksum, you must read these monoliths as texts. They are the empire's sentences. Each chiseled line a declaration that this polity intended to endure. Remember, too, that stone is not only public message. It is also technique. Aksumite masons and engineers applied knowledge of quarrying, of splitting seams, of moving mass with rope, rollers and human rhythm. The very enterprise of stonemaking trained a population in planning. In stages, in sequences that we understand today as administration. The monuments were both display and school, a visible grammar for governance. An empire's influence is measured by what passes through its gates. For Aksum, that gate was Adulis, a coastal node where the monsoon wrote the calendar. Winds came and went with predictable favor. Sailors learned to read them, traders to account for them. From Adulis sailed ivory, gold, cattle, and hides. Into Adulis arrived glass, wine, silk, spices, and perhaps even rumor from the farthest harbors. Here the world touched Aksum. The port functioned like both market and customs office. We must imagine brokers and scribes, scales and ledgers. Cargoes stacked in an organized confusion. Traders came from ports known in Greek and Syriac, from hinterlands whose voices would become Aksumite tax receipts. Languages braided themselves in the quay's dust. Goods changed hands, and with them moved obligations and alliances. Take the trade in gold. It is easy to romanticize Mansa Musa and his caravans. Yet centuries earlier, Aksum had minted gold into coins that carried the king's image and voice into distant markets. These coins were both currency and pamphlet, portable declarations of sovereignty, trust marks that smoothed exchange. To hold an Aksumite coin in a foreign market was to accept, however briefly, the empire's authorship of value. A doulis was not merely transactional. It was a diplomatic hub. Envoys were exchanged, marriages arranged, and religious ideas transmitted. The port condensed global currents into forms Aksum could hold, tax, and repurpose. My people, Aksumite rulership was theatrical, without descending into spectacle for spectacle's sake. Kings styled themselves with lineage and legitimacy. Legends looped back to the Queen of Sheba, to ancestral narratives that anchored the present to mythic past. The rhetoric of kingship mattered. When a king's name was carved into granite, it was not vanity, it was a public memory, placed in a medium intended to outlast rulers and revolutions. King Ezana is the empire's hinge. He reigned at a time when Aksum would accept an identity that fused worldly power and spiritual claim. Under his reign, the material language of kingship shifts toward a new vocabulary. Inscriptions that embed events into communal memory, coins that broadcast affiliation, and policies that draw the peripheries inward. But kingship also required administration. Tribute had to be gathered and recorded, disputes adjudicated, provincial elites managed. Aksum's authority was not purely coercive. It was institutional. Governors and local potentates had their own base. But the crown had claim to the rituals of succession, the right to call on armies, and the means to mediate the great flows of wealth through the empire's arteries. And note the diplomatic craft. The Aksumite court spoke in Greek, to communicate beyond its borders when necessary. It spoke in Ge'ez to consolidate at home. Language, like coins, was a tool of policy. Faith remade Aksum as much as trade and stone. When King Ezana embraced Christianity, he did more than adopt a creed. He reoriented a civilization toward new networks of ecclesiastical and political reciprocity. Christianity in Aksum was not a foreign graft. It was taken on Aksumite terms, written in Ge'ez, and embedded into the ritual grammar of the state. Religious adoption gave Aksum a different axis of legitimacy. The cross on coins and stele signaled an affiliation that resonated with Christian centers across the Mediterranean. It also provided the clerical apparatus necessary to administer the empire's moral economy, laws, schools, and rituals that bound elites and commoners into a shared ethic. Yet Aksum's Christianity did not erase older practices. Syncretism and local variation persisted. The faith became an instrument for governance as much as a set of beliefs. Monasteries functioned as centers of learning and record-keeping. Liturgical language became conservatory. Through faith, Aksum negotiated its place in a world where spiritual capital mattered as much as bullion. Empire is architecture of peace and economy of violence. In the 6th century, Aksum projected force beyond the highlands. King Caleb led armies across the sea into southern Arabia, intervening in the politics of Himyar. This was not a tribal raid. It was a deliberate campaign to assert Aksum's interest, to defend communities linked by faith and alliance, and to safeguard trade nodes vital to imperial coffers. Such expeditions demonstrate two things: logistical capacity, the ability to embark, transport, and sustain forces abroad, and strategic vision, the recognition that control of external nodes mattered for internal stability. Aksum's military was not a blunt instrument. It functioned within a diplomatic calculus, a chess of ports and proxies, where landing a force could alter the balance of commerce and the flow of tribute. Confrontations with neighbors, negotiations with distant polities, and the occasional use of force were part of the record. But Aksum preferred durable outcomes, installing friendly rulers, securing harbors, or ensuring favorable tariffs, to fruitless cycles of occupation. The empire understood projection without permanent annexation as a rational policy in its environment. Empires rarely end with fireworks. Often they decline with the silence of the harbor and the slow rerouting of caravans. The rise of Islam in the 7th century reorganized regional trade networks. New polities and ports along the Arabian coast shifted the flows. The monsoon's routes had alternatives now. Merchants found cheaper or safer harbors. Commercial gravity moved. Adulis, once a hub, dimmed. Inland centers took on different roles. Political authority retreated into the highlands, where Aksumite descendants adapted new forms of rule. But adaptation is not disappearance. The institutions of faith and language, churches, Ge'ez liturgy, monastic learning, endured. The empire's external reach narrowed, but its cultural cores preserved memory. Environmental pressures may have compounded political shifts. Soil erosion, shifting rainfall patterns, and the logistical costs of sustaining distant ports all eroded the old margins. Administrative attention focused where it could be sustained. From this contraction, successor polities rose. Aksum's story did not close. It was folded into subsequent chapters of Ethiopian statehood. To speak of Aksum is to speak of lineage. Even when the polity's ships no longer sailed as before, its monuments and its script continued. Ge'ez remained a liturgical anchor. Churches retained memory through rites and manuscripts. Stone continued to speak. The idea of Aksum resided not only in relics but in identity. Later rulers claimed descent. Communities preserved chants and liturgies. And artisans kept old forms alive in new objects. The empire's architecture, its coins, its inscriptions, all remained as evidence that African power had produced modes of governance, diplomacy, and culture independent of outside tutelage. When we look to the present, we see traces, place names, church calendars, liturgical language, and a landscape that still bears its monuments. Aksum is not an archaeological curiosity. It is a locus for understanding how African polities could command trade, craft durable institutions, and imagine themselves into permanence. And so we return to the mountain and the sea. Aksum chose both, and in doing so taught us a simple ethic: infrastructure is political, ritual is statecraft, and memory is a weapon against oblivion. My people, the horizon was not a limit for them. It was an address. Stories are political tools. To remember Aksum is to insist upon a continent that authored its own systems of power. Empires in Africa were not pale reflections of others. They were original, adaptive, and strategic. Aksum minted authority, carved permanence, wrote in its own letters, and ruled the sea as a resource. In remembering it, we reclaim a necessary truth, that African history is full of evidence. And evidence resists simplification. Let this be a reminder and a summons. Study the coins. Read the stele. Listen to the liturgy. You will find not myth, but reason power. This is Ancestral Files. Subscribe. You're part of history.
My people, before Europe drew lines on a map, the savannah already had a superpower. A kingdom where cavalry moved like lightning and kings shared power with fearless checkmates called Oyo Empire. This was Oyo, the thunder in Yoruba history. If you think checks and balances is a modern thing, Oyo said, "Hold my calabash." The story begins in Ife, the city of creation for the Yoruba. Onion or Anmian leaves Ife, finds fertile plains, plants a city. Names change, power grows. Oyo rises north of modern Ibadan, where horses can gallop and cavalry matters. If Onion were alive, he'd complain about modern traffic. Oyo's power ran on 3 engines: horses, trade, and institutions. Cavalry. On the open savannah, a mounted army is king. Oyo mastered mounted warfare earlier and better than many of its neighbors. They used lances, light armor, and speed like thunder striking a line and vanishing. Trade and economy. Oyo bridged forest and savannah, controlling kola, salt, horses, and eventually the sad commerce of the coast. Markets in Oyo thrummed. Cowries dictated value like stock tickers, but with more drums. Their stock exchange, a market square, and a well-timed public flogging. You missed your delivery. No refunds. Military logistics and forts. Oyo built forted towns, provincial governors, and logistics lines. Their supply chains were efficient. Move horses, move lances, move tribute. Oyo didn't only fight, it thought, legislated, and ritualized power. The Olafin sat on a throne of state, but the kingdom was kept honest. By the Oyo Messi and the Ugboni, a king could rule, but he could also be asked to step down with decorum and an empty calabash. Political structure. The Olafin was powerful, but the Oyo Messi 7 kingmakers were the check. The Basharoon led them, if a king misruled. The ritual was to present an empty calabash or a parrot's feather, a polite but unmistakable political resign. Religion and Orisa. Sango, the thunder god, was central. Ogun, Ifa, and ancestral cults shaped court life. Priests were judges, doctors, and political advisors. Arts and material culture. Oyo is famous for brass, beadwork, and textile mastery. Bronze heads, elaborate crowns, every object carried status and memory. If your bling didn't sparkle, you probably weren't invited to court. Every empire meets its storm. Oyos came from internal strife, rising neighbors, and the tidal forces of the Atlantic world. Internal divisions. Succession fights, powerful generals, and a Basharoon who sometimes overplayed his hand. These fissures widened. Politics turned poisonous. Threat from Dahomey and coastal powers. Dahomey professionalized warfare and launched raids. Oyo's control over vassals frayed. European guns in the wrong hands could be decisive. Ilorin revolt and northern alliances. Ilorin, once a cavalry hub, breaks away. It allies with northern Fulani forces. Oyo Isle is sacked. Capitals shift. The political order collapses. You can survive a drought, a raid, a gossip scandal, but once your military town turns traitor, that's a Monday you can't come back from. Oyo's empire may have crumbled, but the civilization endured. Yoruba culture thrived in cities, Ibadan, Abeokuta, Oshogbo. The institutions, the art, the law, these are ancestral currents still guiding millions. Festivals such as Igungan, Sango worship, brass casting techniques, oral epics, these are living memories. The Oyo political idea, checks on kings, still influences, local governance and cultural pride. Scholars, local chiefs, and cultural centers are reclaiming Oyo's history, digital archives, museum repatriations, and community projects. The lesson: Oyo teaches us resilience, balanced governance, and that power without wisdom collapses. The thunder has quieted, but its echo remains. Oyo reminds us that Africa made empires, built complex law, and practiced politics that outclass many later models. If you want to understand modern West Africa, start with Oyo, the kingdom that turned horse into thunder, and calabashs into constitutional checks. We're partners on this journey. Keep your drums close and your curiosity closer. This is Ancestral Files. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. You're part of history. My people, there's a wild claim out there: before a Yoruba Dubba could wear the crown, he had to eat the heart or liver of his predecessor and drink his blood to absorb his spirit. Truth or myth? Today we test the story, not your stomach. Did Yoruba kings literally consume organs and blood? Or is this another colonial exaggeration of sacred rites? Stay with me. We'll separate ritual symbolism from sensational rumor, and you'll vote on what you think really happened. First, the rumor. Some 19th century travel accounts and tavern stories claimed that on the eve of coronation, the incoming Dubba had to ingest pieces of the late king to inherit his strength. They spoke of hearts, livers, even blood. But here's the problem. Many of those writers never witnessed a coronation. They relied on hearsay, misread secret rites, or blended human sacrifice in royal ceremonies with cannibal myths. Secrecy plus imagination equals big headlines. Now let's talk what we do know. Yoruba kingship is drenched in Akechi spiritual power. During coronation, the king undergoes seclusion, purification, divination, oaths, and blessings. Symbolic meals. Yes, literal flesh. No verified evidence. Typical sacred elements include kola nut obi, shared in truth-telling and communion with ancestors. Palm wine, poured as libation. Sacrificial meat, from goats, rams, fowl offered to deities and ancestors, then ritually shared. Herbal preparations agbo, for protection and longevity. These foods are carriers of Akechi. Eating and drinking here is spiritual technology, not cannibalism. It's about absorbing blessing, not a body. Which item best symbolizes continuity of power? Kola, palm wine, sacrificial meat, herbal agbo. Pause to write it down in the comments. So, how did symbolic meal become eating the old king? 3 ingredients. 1. Secrecy. Outsiders fill gaps with fantasy. 2. Spectacle. Shocking stories travel fast. 3. Confusion of rites. Funerary sacrifices near royal deaths were real in some eras, but that's not the same as cannibalism. Over time, the tidy phrase absorb his spirit got twisted into consume his organs. Language can mislead when you want a headline. Respect to Yoruba tradition. Coronations are about covenant with the people, harmony with the deities, and continuity with ancestors. The golden rule of interpretation: if a claim dehumanizes a people, check the sources twice. Our verdict today: myth busted. Yoruba kingship uses sacred foods and rites to transmit Akechi. No reliable proof of routine organ eating or blood drinking. But you decide. Comment what you think. It's either
A. Pure myth.
B. Tiny kernel exaggerated. C. I'm not convinced. My people, if you learned something new, like the video, share it, and tag someone who needs myth from truth. Next interactive session, drop a ritual or legend you want us to investigate. Subscribe, comment, share. This is Ancestral Files, history with receipts. You're part of history. Long before Wakanda, before samurai swords clashed under cherry blossoms, there was Yasuke, a real African warrior who shook 16th century Japan to its core. He wasn't a myth, he was an anime, he was real, and his arrival, let's just say, it caused more chaos than a drum circle at a Zen temple. The story begins somewhere in East Africa, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Sudan. Historians still argue, louder than uncles at a funeral buffet. But what we do know, Yasuke was brought to India by the Portuguese, and then destiny rerouted him straight to Japan. By 1579, Yasuke was serving a Jesuit priest named Alessandro Valignano, a man determined to spread Catholicism across Asia. But while Valignano had God on his lips, everyone had Yasuke on their minds, a 6'2" African giant walking through feudal Japan. That's like dropping Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson into a Game of Thrones episode barefoot. You see, Japan was homogeneous. Most people had never seen a foreigner before, let alone one with dark skin, muscles like carved obsidian, and the calm demeanor of a monk on mute. Some thought he was a god, others a demon. A few even tried to scrub the black off his skin. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But Yasuke wasn't just different, he was disciplined. Fluent in multiple languages, strong, smart, fiercely loyal, exactly the kind of man who'd catch the attention of one of Japan's most powerful warlords, Oda Nobunaga. And just like that, Yasuke's days as a bodyguard were over. He was about to become a samurai, the first African in Japanese history to do so. Not bad for a guy they thought was magic. Imagine this. You walk into a warlord's palace barefoot, foreign, and fresh off the boat. And instead of tossing you out, the most powerful man in Japan says, I like your vibe. Want a sword? This wasn't some side gig. Yasuke was officially adopted into the Nobunaga clan, given a katana, a private residence, a stipend, and perhaps most shocking of all, he got respected. In a world where outsiders were usually treated like viruses in a samurai immune system, Yasuke became a VIP. Now don't get it twisted. Yasuke didn't just sit around drinking sake and taking selfies with his katana. He trained hard, swordsmanship, strategy, battle etiquette. And brr, this ain't Hollywood. One wrong move.
Your sushi.
Soon, Yasuke wasn't just a samurai. He was Nobunaga's right-hand man, his bodyguard, his enforcer, his "don't make me call Yasuke" warning. Think of him as a one-man Wakandan secret service. Then came the real test. War was brewing, and not just any war. This was the battle for Japan itself. Rival clans, betrayals, samurai Game of Thrones type drama. And Yasuke? He was right in the middle of it. In 1582, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechimitsu Hide. It was a coup. A setup. And Yasuke? He was in the temple when it all went down. Imagine protecting your boss, while the whole building is literally burning around you. Nobunaga died that day. Yasuke didn't run. He fought. Till the last sword cracked, till the last man fell. But the tides had turned, and not even an African warrior could stop what was coming. And just like that, the African samurai vanished from Japanese history. No records, no monuments, just silence. Until centuries later, his legend would rise again, in books, in anime, in Netflix shows, and right now, on your screen. So, what happened to Yasuke? Did he return to Africa, live out his life as a legend among monks, or just disappear like a mist over Kyoto? The truth is, nobody knows. Japanese records mention him briefly after Nobunaga's death, handed over to the Jesuits, then silence. Not even a footnote? That's how history treats black greatness sometimes. Admire it for a moment, then bury it. But come on now, you think a six to shredded African man who walked into Japan and became a samurai just disappears. Please, Yasuke didn't vanish. He became a legend. In the 20th century, researchers, writers, and proud black historians started digging. They found clues, mentions in missionary journals, whispers in Japanese oral traditions. And what emerged was more than just a samurai. It was a symbol. Yasuke was proof that black excellence didn't start with slavery, that black warriors didn't need rescuing, they wore the armor, and that global black stories aren't just about pain, they're about power. Yasuke's legacy echoes today. In classrooms, in movies, in cosplay conventions, and yes, even in anime. Who would have thought? A man born in Africa would one day star in a Netflix series with robot ninjas. The ancestors are probably watching like, hey, see this twist? But here's the deeper truth. Yasuke represents something sacred. The untold stories. The hidden heroes. The black footprints history tried to sweep away. He is a reminder that our ancestors went everywhere, and they mattered. So today, we say Yasuke's name loud and proud, because he wasn't just a samurai, he was a mirror, showing us what happens when courage meets culture, when strength meets grace, when a warrior walks boldly into history and writes his name in fire. The African samurai lives on. My people, never forget, our ancestors weren't just broken, they were brilliant. And Yasuke, he wasn't a myth, he was a man, a black man, in armor, in honor, in history. To the ancestors who walked boldly into foreign lands, we remember you.